Okay, hello. I hope you can hear me. It's a very strange, abstract world we are living in, and I'm no more comfortable with Zoom than anybody else, but here I am. And I have to say that I wouldn't be here if it were not for Oscar Tenreiro, because it's Oscar who has constantly been on my case, so to speak, to participate in this event. And I have to say, I'm very honored to do so. I would like to thank the University of Málaga and the faculty of the School of Architecture for this opportunity to give you what is called, I suppose, an opening lecture. And I have to say that I've known for Oscar, I think, for nearly 50 years. And we have been together on numerous occasions, and we have, of course, one thing very much in common, which is our belief in the importance of structure in relation to architectural form. You know, of course, that was the subject matter of my book, The Studies in Tectonic Culture. And I realized that one of the figures, or a figure, in fact, that is very common to us, who's a sort of almost a hero for both of us, is the Estonian engineer who came to America actually before the Second World War, and was in fact the engineer for Louis Kahn. Without this engineer, Kahn would have been able to achieve much less than what he did throughout his entire career. The name of this engineer, perhaps not so well known, is August Commandant. And in fact, Oscar wrote a study on Commandant, actually met Commandant, which I never did. I think interviewed him on more than one occasion. So Commandant is the big thing that we have in common, and this issue of the poetics of construction and the revelation of construction as being, to some extent, a central aspect of architectural culture. But at the same time, there are many things which we do not agree about, and during the course of today's proceedings, I'm sure you will all eventually find out these fundamental differences of opinion, which, as a matter of fact, I only fully discovered in preparing for this event, because to honor an aphorism by Emilio Ambas, Argentine architect, critic, inventor, etc., who maintains that spontaneity has to be rehearsed. And so we did indeed try to rehearse this and have a little exchange with each other exactly what it was we were going to talk about. And then we discovered we have certain areas of intense disagreement. One perhaps is over the issue of the role of the critic in relation to the culture of architecture, where Oscar is extremely skeptical about critics, which of course includes also myself, since I would say, perhaps more than a historian, I have played a role of a critic in relation to architectural culture. The second point is of disagreement, perhaps, is the question of the automobile, because I think I shocked Oscar by telling him very recently that I thought that the most apocalyptic invention that the species had ever made was the invention of the automobile. And Oscar, of course, doesn't agree with me about this at all. And particularly when I go to the extreme of saying that I think that the automobile was a more apocalyptic invention than the atomic bomb. And the third point, I suppose, is the relationship between socialism and the modern movement in architecture, about which I feel very strongly. And so we have these three issues: the automobile, socialism, and the role of critics. Which brings me to one particular critic whom I greatly admire, that is to say, Luis Fernandez Galeano, who is, of course, the critic, historian, architect, editor of two important magazines in Spain, Arquitectura Viva and AV. My talk today has the title, 7 Reflections on the Predicament of Architecture in the 21st Century. And I will just pass briefly through each of these reflections. But before I do so, I should say there is also a subtitle, which is a manifesto for Malaga. And I intend to write this lecture up more formally and of course give it to the school so that it can be translated into Spanish. I very much regret that I do not have any capacity in Spanish, unlike my wife. And perhaps that's something, since I have retired from teaching, I should devote much more of my time to trying to master Spanish, I think. So let me go to the reflections. The first reflection is architecture and reality. And yes, one of my prejudices, let's say, is that I think architects have to confront reality more than any other profession. The division of labor is such that it's possible for other professions to limit themselves within a certain frame, specialization. They do not have to look too closely at the real world. I mean, I'm thinking of certain kinds of scientists or applied technicians who can fulfill their, what can I say, professional destiny without looking too hard at the real world. But that is not a privilege that's accorded to architects, ever. Because as soon as you have a client, and as soon as you have a site, and as soon as you have a budget, of course, you confront reality in that micro sense, the limit of reality. And I think that that's also true in a much bigger sense as well. I mean, I'm reminded in this regard of an American ironic musician, songster named Tom Lehrer, who wrote in the 1950s a number of cynical lyrics, one of which was about the German rocket scientist Wernher von Braun. And in the course of this song, he says, and this personifies the division of labor, the rockets go up, who cares where they come down? It's not my department, said Wernher von Braun. And that, I think, sums up perfectly what happens in many other fields, but not in architecture. The second reflection, reflection number 2, time, philosophy, and history, and architecture. And I think that here again, one finds something very unique. I mean, if you go to other departments in the university, or let us say, certainly other departments in the technical university, departments of science, of physics, chemistry, of astrophysics, of cybernetics, of microatomic studies, you will find no emphasis on history at all. History is of no consequence to an advanced cybernetician or atomic scientist or biologist, or et cetera, et cetera. They do not spend their time preoccupied with the history of science, mostly not. But this is not true of architecture, obviously. History remains as an important agent for understanding this field. I would say there are 2 actually related fields that are of the utmost importance to architecture. One is history and the other is philosophy. And of course, the history of philosophy. I'm someone who thinks that in schools of architecture, there should be some kind of fundamental course on philosophy for first-year students, even, however schematic. And indeed, I know in France, for example, even in higher education, in high schools, philosophy is occasionally taught. That would be unthinkable in the United States. no one would teach philosophy to high school students. My second reflection is on the issue of criticism and material culture. Sorry, this is my third reflection, because the second one was on this question of time, philosophy, and history. And also, which I forgot to mention, on the idea of the Enlightenment. I mean, the way in which the Enlightenment is a fundamental basis to the modern experience of architecture. And therefore, of course, the Enlightenment involves philosophy right away. It involves, of course, Schiller, Kant, Hegel, Marx, all of whom were part of the German Enlightenment. So time, history, and philosophy, that was my second reflection. My third reflection, criticism and material culture. I believe that all culture, including architecture, is a living wave-like phenomena, that it comes into being out of conscious cultivation, and that the role of both the critic and the practitioner is to contribute to its cultivation. And one might also say, of course, the role of schools of architecture and universities is to do the same. I am reflecting on the roles played by critics like myself and editors like Luis Fernandez Galeano, who, by the way, seems to be something of an anathema for OSCAR. Their role in architectural magazines and in the cultivation of architectural culture is of the highest importance, and this is particularly so in Spain. I think it is a very extraordinary fact that still now the best magazines of architectural record in the world are Spanish. I have in mind, of course, El Croquis and also AV, Arquitectura Viva, the magazines edited by Galeano. But one should also mention here in passing the important tradition of small magazines in Spain. I mean, I think also magazines produced by universities. I'm thinking in particular of a magazine coming out of the University of Navarre, who I think has the title R, and is a kind of research magazine of the highest quality that is, of course, unfortunately not that well known internationally, but is of the greatest importance, I think, within Spanish architectural culture. And then I think I would like to also touch on the role, which now is very much reduced, of the magazines that were supported by the Colegio system in the 70s and 80s in Spain. And I will return to this question of the Colegio system a little later, because of course the Colegio system has been in many ways a victim of what I think must be called neoliberalism and deregulation, because also as it passed through Brussels and the European Union, that restricted the power of the Colegio system in Spain, and with that, of course, reduced their importance, reduced their economic viability, and also reduced their capacity to sponsor, support local magazines. I mean, I have in mind, of course, the magazine out of Madrid, edited by Anton Capital, the magazine out of Barcelona, edited by Edward Bru and Jose Luis Mateo, and so on. And one can find parallels of this, of course, in other countries, but not of the Colegio system. Although I'm thinking of the role played by magazines, well, certainly in the 50s by the Architectural Review, which was an extraordinary magazine throughout the 50s and the 60s, maybe even into the 70s. Today, it's a very pale echo of its former self. But when I studied architecture in the 50s, the Architectural Review was of the utmost importance in the UK and also elsewhere. Or one thinks of the magazine in France, L'Architecture d'aujourd'hui, first edited by Bloch, and then in the 70s by Bernard Huet, who made it into an extraordinary critical magazine. Okay, this brings me to my fourth reflection on architecture and the state. In the fourth edition of Modern Architectural Critical History that was published in 2007, I argued that there are countries in which one could identify a culture of architecture, that is to say, a culture of architecture rather than one or two star architects. I think that is true of, I maintained then in 2007, that was true of 4 countries. And they are, were, perhaps in a way still are, Finland, Japan, Spain, and France. And I'm talking about these 4 countries and their cultures of architecture under the rubric of architecture and the state, because this is basically my topic in reflection number 4. Because in each case, one finds that the state played an enormously important role in patronizing architecture. If we take the case of Finland, for example, and the Soviet Union, because I think we have to put them together, because it's out of the tension between the Finnish state and the Soviet Union that the enormous support given by the Finnish state to architecture emerges. And one has to remember that the Finns had suffered at the hands of the Soviet Union on 2 occasions, first in the Winter War and then in the Continuation War. And in 1945, they were closely aligned, of course, with the Pax Americana and with the division of the world under the Cold War between the American sphere of influence and the Soviet Russian sphere of influence. And they were on the absolute frontier between these two, in fact. And there was a problem for the Finnish state in maintaining a kind of balancing act between, in the Cold War, between the Pax Americana on the one hand and the Soviet Union on the other. And architecture was used by the Finnish state, and its patronage of architecture was of the utmost importance to the post-war brilliance, one could say, of the work of Alvar Aalto, for example, but also many other Finnish architects of his generation. Then, if you come to the mid-50s, when Japan finally escapes from American occupation, which took place, of course, in 1945, immediately after the war, there was a challenge of reconstructing the Japanese state, and for that matter, Japanese industry, under the auspices of the state. And the entire career of Kenzo Tange, for example, is obviously deeply involved, beginning in the mid-50s, with the Japanese state. And you can see this, of course, and maybe one of the most remarkable urban plans, like the very last urban plan of real consequence to be even imagined in the modern world, is, of course, Tange's plan for Tokyo Bay of 1960. And in this regard, we can say that Japanese architecture and the generation of Tange, Maekawa, Sakakura, etc., after the Second World War, have this, it represents a kind of upwardly mobile wave of cultural energy, which lasts from 1960 to 1970. I mean, in the case of Tange, absolutely, between the Tokyo Bay on the one hand and the Osaka World Exhibition on the other. After Osaka, 1970, Tange's work is never the same. In fact, Tange will hardly build in Japan after 1970. So, this is actually, I'm emphasizing this because there is this issue of a kind of rise and fall of architectural culture, and you can see it in a figure like Kenzo Tange between 1955 and 1970. And in Spain, after the death of Franco in 1975, there is an enormous release of energy. You know, you could say the retardation of Spain under Franco, under Franquista government, left a void in a way, left, I mean, there was a question, I think, after Franco's demise of modernizing Spain, of sort of catching up in a sense. And in this regard, I think a very important role was played by the Spanish city-state. And here we could also say by the Spanish city-state and the colegio system. That, in fact, the city-states of Spain were very important patrons for architecture. And also you have this manifestation of many architects in Spain operating at an extremely high level. I think this also has a lot to do, of course, with Spanish architecture education and the status of the architect in Spanish culture. It's of the utmost interest to me that until very recently, and perhaps even now, any building in Spain had to have an architect, even the most modest building. By law, an architect had to be involved in the supervision of a building. And then if I come to France, you can see that there, I suppose, the rupture, the break point is the student revolt in Paris of May 1968. Because after that, the Gaullist French state that had been in control from 1945 to 1968 is kind of is recast, as it were. You know, the French also decide to modernize the state. In fact, of course, to distribute the power over the rest of France and not concentrated entirely in Paris. And so, you know, as I've already mentioned, you know, these architectural magazines like L'Architecture d'aujourd'hui, Architecture, Mouvement et Continuité, play an enormously important role in the development of French culture, and also in the. Now today, if you look at the situation today, you do not find the same capacity for architecture in France as you did between 1972, which is the date of the Centre Pompidou in Paris, the competition won by Renzo Piano and Richard Rogers, which in many ways is the beginning of the French Renaissance, so to speak. But this energy, which would, I think it's hard to say when it starts to lose its confidence, but its confidence was very much dependent on the patronage of the state, so that, for instance, the state ran many student competitions, and even the second or third prize in these student competitions was given a small commission by the state. That doesn't happen anymore in France. And probably there are far less competitions in France than there were during the period of the 70s and 80s. So therefore, of course, we also come to the relationship of the culture of competitions in relation to architectural culture in general. And here, there is also something very interesting about if we compare continental Europe to the Anglo-American world. I mean, in the UK and in the US, competitions are extremely rare. In Finland, after the Second World War and up to, well, very recently, I think, almost every public building had to be a competition. So nothing was awarded to anybody except through the presence of competition. So this also is an interesting reflection on what it is that sustains or doesn't sustain architectural culture and the role of the state in the patronage of architectural culture. Which brings me to reflection number 5. You know, there are actually 7 reflections altogether, so we are getting there. And this reflection turns on the theme of postmodernism and neoliberalism, because it's fascinating. In a way, 1979 is the date of Jean-Francois Lyotard's philosophical work, The Postmodern Condition, which, by the way, I think ultimately concludes, it's a very strange book in a way, because it concludes with technoscience, and only with technoscience as the way for the future, basically, which is a very strange, I think, and limited conclusion. But in 1980, this is the year that the first edition of Modern Architecture Critical History is published. And that history was a product of my obsession with the whole trajectory of the modern tradition, particularly in Europe and the States, up to, well, really up to that date, 1980. But so the kind of the polemical position implied by the first edition of Modern Architecture Critical History, which is a position arguing more or less for the continuation of the modern project, is the very same year that the Venice Biennale, with an exhibition curated by Paolo Portuguesi, presents postmodernism as a scenographic, scenic effect, Robert Venturi's concept of the decorated shed, in the Strada Novissima in the Venice Biennale, with the little shop fronts by various kind of rising architects on either side of a single street, so-called New Street, Strada Novissima. And in fact, my reaction to that was in 1983, the one-off essay for which I suppose I'm notoriously famous, towards critical regionalism, 6 points for an architecture of resistance. It's quite clear I've expanded the points from 6 to 7 reflections in the case of this reflection on the predicament of architecture in the 21st century. But it's interesting, if you look at the chronology, 79 is Jean-Francois Lyotard's The Postmodern Condition. 1980 is the first edition of Modern Architecture Critical History. 1980 is also the first full Architecture Venice Biennale, curated by Paolo Portuguesi, under the slogan, "The End of Prohibition and the Presence of the Past." 1979, 1 year before, Margaret Thatcher becomes the Prime Minister of the UK. 1981, 2 years later, Ronald Reagan becomes the President of the United States. These two figures are fundamental to the beginnings of neoliberalism in the Anglo-American world. And that is to say, deregulation, in other words, to deregulate capitalism. It's clear that the New Deal of the early 30s under Roosevelt was a regulation of capitalism. And that sustained itself, I think, one way or another, up until 1970. But a decade later, this regulation of capitalism is relinquished at a rather remarkable speed, in fact. And so it's very interesting in this regard that von Hayek, who was an Austrian economist, who wrote a book called The Way to Serfdom, is the philosophical origin of Margaret Thatcher's neoliberalism. And what is interesting here in the case of Thatcher is that the British provincial cities are very much the power of the British provincial city, which was never that strong, by the way, compared to the city-state of Italy or the city-state of Spain, is greatly reduced under Thatcher's government. All the power is concentrated in London, and of course in corporate capitalism. This is, I think, an indisputable fact of what happened. And this also eventually would affect Spain, as I've already indicated, because the Spanish city-state, and above all the Spanish architectural colegio system, was definitely undermined by deregulation filtered through the European Union, because this neoliberalist project, certainly the European Union was not immune to the attractions of neoliberalism. It's fascinating for me to think that the last British new town, the first one, of course, is in the mid-40s, the last one is in 1972, and is in fact Milton Keynes, which is like a kind of grid of Los Angeles superimposed over the Buckinghamshire countryside, under the influence of Melvin Webber, who coined the phrase non-place urban realm, this contradictory phrase. Which brings me to my sixth point, technological maximization and consumerism. And two, of course, my view that the automobile is the ultimate apocalyptical invention, because, and here, of course, Louis Kahn was of exactly the same opinion. I mean, he regarded the automobile as a destructive force, destructive of the city. The city, in fact, should protect itself from the automobile. And in fact, Kahn thought you couldn't enter Philadelphia unless you entered through the railroad station, through the Beaux-Arts railway station in the center of Philadelphia. You couldn't really enter Philadelphia for Kahn from the airport by car. I mean, it's a totally wild, mythical obsession, of course. But of course, literally you can, but symbolically you can't. There is no point at which you enter. This is the kind of slightly outmoded idea that Kahn was preoccupied with. And the consequences of what Geoffrey Jellicoe, a British landscape architect, calls motopia, is of course the proliferation of totally unrelated objects all over the place. You know, the whole suburbanization of the US, the transcontinental freeway system, has led to a kind of proliferation of objects, one totally unrelated to the next, totally isolated from the next, a total dispersal, a kind of detritus, in fact. The product par excellence of consumerism. And this brings me to my seventh point, which is modern architecture in relation to climate change. And I think, as COVID-19 suggests, that it's only the state that can really have the authority and the economic power to, in a way, save the species from the impact of climate change. Because it's quite clear that private capital is not going to invest in solar panels and wind turbines and high-speed trains and light rail and all these things, which is so evidently absent in the United States. You know, more prevalent, of course, in Europe, particularly in Scandinavia, but also throughout Europe to some extent. Of course, high-speed rail is a fundamental achievement, in a way, of the European continent, as it is, of course, of the island of Japan. In all these cases, of course, the high-speed rail, the Shinkansen in Japan depend upon investment by the state, as does the incredible thing that the Japanese would build an airport outside Osaka in the middle of the sea. Clearly, this kind of development cannot take place without the state. And so if we are going to do anything serious about climate change, which is beginning to manifest itself in the elevation of the levels of the sea, in forest fires breaking out all over the place, and of course, COVID, which is in a way a direct product of globalization, it's only the state, I think, that will have the resources and the will to apply, to invest in public works, to do something about the climate change with which the species is challenged ever increasingly year after year. So in this sense, of course, architecture is not, as it were, in the forefront of this, this enterprise, but certainly can be part of it. Which brings me to another thought, by the way, that from the point of view of the the destruction of the difference between the town and the countryside, the erosion of the city, the proliferation of objects all over the place, the discipline that can really help, perhaps, much more than architecture, is landscape architecture. And in my opinion, landscape architecture perhaps has more to contribute to architecture and certainly to urban design than the separate professions of urban design and architecture. I mean, it's clear to me that landscape architects can achieve things at the level of the environment, which most planners and urban designers are incapable of doing. And so I think I cannot emphasize enough the importance, in my opinion, of landscape architecture. Let me end with, well, in a way where I began, because I began with the 4th edition of Modern Architecture, Critical History. And the chapter, the last chapter of the 4th edition is Architecture in the Age of Globalization. And at the beginning of this chapter, I cite a quotation from a New Zealand ecologist, I think one could say. It comes out of a seminar which I think was organized in New Zealand under the title, Is Capitalism Sustainable? And in this quotation, which is at the head of the last chapter, I quote from O'Connor's essay, which has that title, an essay in which O'Connor advocates an ecological Marxism, in fact. And this is just a very short quote, a quote within the quote. The globalization of capital is somewhat spurious. The rhetoric stresses harmonization and optimization, but the reality is disorder and conflict. The fact is that the planet is materially finite. By the way, something I did not mention, which is the Club of Rome, report of the Club of Rome made in 1972 would stress then, which is a very long time ago, the finite character of the planet. In other words, of course, the limits of economies based on extraction. And so he says, the fact is that the planet is materially finite and that capital cannot control the modification and reproduction of natural, quote unquote, conditions of production in the same way as it purports to regulate industrial commodity production. Thank you.
I suppose everything is all right. I'm not very used to use these electronic things, but I suppose I can see Kenneth now. And I wanted to make a very short introduction. I think that Kenneth Frampton is my friend. That's very particular to say that, because you never know when you are a friend of the British. But I suppose that he is my friend. And I will be trying to conduct this conversation as a conversation between two friends. Because it is not that I have a sort of mistrust on critics. What I think is that critics tend to be always in a sort of, there is a saying in English, which is beating by the woods or something like that. You know, critics are always surrounding things and very rarely focusing to a particular thing and take a position. I think that Kenneth has been throughout his life a different kind of critic because he has taken positions, but always with care about the consequences of that. And I understand that because when you are dealing with architects, it is always difficult to be clear in what you are affirming or you are sustaining. And I think that is a condition of the exercise of criticism. But there is another thing, which is the consequences of this sort of generalization that permeates the discourse of critics, which is very simply saying it in a very simple way, that everything can be done, and also the critics will find a way of justifying it or denying it in a very subtle way. And we confront now in architecture a very curious situation that most of the bad architecture that has been produced in the central countries has never been let's say, clearly denounced in terms of its poor contribution to architectural culture. There are so many false stars in the panorama, the general panorama, and you are always trying to find that the person who will be with enough authority to say this shouldn't be done, or that is perhaps too drastic, or this has been done and it has this and that and many other problems regarding its consequence in architectural culture. Well, this sort of, I would say, concept on the relation of the critics and the ways architecture is developing the world has been my concern for many, many, many years. And it's my concern because when you listen to Ken recently, you can see that he stays in the part of the world where architecture is being built, which is the central countries, I mean, the axis, Japan, Europe, the United States. What happened with the rest of the world? What happened a country like, for instance, like Venezuela, which is a country which has been destroyed by a political fraud in the name of socialism, by instance, which is not a socialism, by the way, which is a caricature. What happened with that? What happened with all the countries in the Mid-Eastern territory? What happened in Africa? I mean, the presence of the world is not reflected in architectural debate. And when Ken, it's too long for me, when Ken was nominated in Colombia, it was like 30 years ago, or even more than that.
No.
I had the hope that his position would allow a sort of aperture to the world in some terms. And that was very naive from myself. It was the same feeling that I had when Rafael Moneo was in Harvard. I thought, okay, Moneo, who knows what we are trying to do, perhaps will take his word, his interest, and will try to connect with our problems. But that never happened. That I know that Moneo is conscious of this, but there is a sort of structure that prevents the aperture of the architectural debate. So what has happened with me and my relation with Kenneth is that I always have been trying to have a sort of dialogue with him in terms of the general debate. I know that has been also very partial, very incomplete, but I think it was my feeling. Now, I wanted to talk to him, and I will let him talk. And in front of this Spanish atmosphere, which has allowed me to say something through the exhibition, by the way, through the book, which is a very curious book because it is not a typical disciplinary, refined book. It is a sort of autobiography. It is a sort of reflection on the conditions of my exercise. It is completely out of the canon in architectural books. But that's what I wanted to tell to, I would say, to the young people and to my colleagues in Spain. Well, now we have this opportunity. I feel very, very well about it, but I would like to say so many things. Let's, Kenneth, respond to this, these many ideas together, you know.
Yeah, can I respond now? Can people hear me?
Sure, you can do it.
Right. Okay, Oscar, thank you so much for what you said and for the content, and also for the generosity and the warmth you have expressed in your remarks addressed towards me. And it made me think about certain failures, I would say, and also of certain colleagues who have expressed at different times incredible courage, as a matter of fact. I wonder myself, what occasions have I expressed a similar courage? That is to say, as a critic, you know. I do think that, for example, the position I took at the time of the Venice Biennale, which is the subject of this notorious essay of mine towards the critical regionalism that came out in '83, was a moment of taking a position, an unequivocal position. But I am reminded of a colleague who is not that well known, who is actually of Chinese origin, but brought up in Germany, but educated in England and has spent like 20 years in England. So he is in many ways also extremely British. Ends up in Berlin, where he now lives, and is a visiting teacher in the University of Austin in Texas in the School of Architecture. He still is. I mean, he shares the position with his partner, and one comes for one semester and one for the other, etc. So they're able to keep the small practice in Berlin alive. But one of the things that I think is exceptional about Wilfried is that when Peter Eisenman won the commission in Santiago de Compostela with a very chaotic work, which was never ever finally realized, I think. The only member of the jury who would actually take a dissenting position and be public about it was Wilfried Wang, who refused to.
Excuse me. Who?
Wilfried Wang. This is this, Chinese figure of Chinese origin from Hamburg, living in England for a long time, but now living in Berlin and teaching in the States. And Wang had the courage to take this kind of this minority position. And the minority position was obviously right, I mean, when I think of the other members of the jury, I'm completely astonished, that how could this happen, so to speak, and I think there are many things like that. And I wanted to bring up another point which raises the whole issue of reason, rationality, leadership, in this 21st century. Because it brings up the city of Hamburg again, because the city of Hamburg commissions Herzog de Meuron to design an opera house, which is then put on top of an 11-story parking garage. And you have to ask yourself, forget about the architects, what about the client? Why does the client think that this is in any way a reasonable concept? It's just, I will never get over it. How could the leadership of the city of Hamburg do such an unbelievably irrational thing? That leaves me totally and utterly speechless. And of course, these architects are, in that sense, of course, as culpable as the client, but it's the client that totally bewilders me. How can this leadership commission a building like that? This is something I think is a very extreme example. And by the way, I think this figure, Wilfried Wang, took a position very clear against that. So it is true, that architectural critics, in this sense, perhaps also myself, have not played a role that is as active as they should in relation to contemporary production. I mean, I do have very definite prejudices from this point of view, but I think I could have done more, is what I'm trying to say. Basically, I could have done much more.
Let me interrupt you in something.
Yes, go ahead.
The Elba, this building in Hamburg that you have mentioned, it is really absurd in many ways. I wrote something about it in my blog. I dedicated a long essay on that building, trying to approach its inconsistencies and its problems. But that I know, it was built and considered by the general status, or I would say by the establishment of architecture, as something, good, something interesting, and something that deserved some stream like a symbol to the city and this and that. But take the example, for instance, of some of the buildings of Zaha Hadid. This is another example of arbitrariness based in a sort of, I would say, self-confidence that everything that comes out of a personal will has the right to exist. That happens with Calatrava, with his Grand Central in New York, which is something really incredible, you know. And that has happened, well, not to mention Frank Gehry. Some of the Frank Gehry buildings, the Stata Center in Boston is a terrible building. Not only that it has some construction problems, but it is a terrible building. And that is, even if that is I would say, a commonplace to say these things about these buildings. That hasn't been underlined in the architectural debate in any respect. At the same time, let's go to another problem, which is what happened in the world with the conditions to build architecture. You were saying the importance of the state, which I think it is basic, the importance of the state as the promoter of architecture. And at the same time, Spain came to be considered as a culture of a new architecture coming out as a sort of second wave after modernism, which was the product of democracy. The explosion of architecture in Spain has a strong relation with the gaining of a new political system, which is democracy. Democracy is necessary to produce architecture. We cannot think of architecture out of democracy. And that has been the main reason for the stagnation of architectural culture in countries in Latin America, for instance. That's a very interesting issue that maybe you have some comments about it.
Yes, I do. Well, you raised a lot of issues, but I think that you know, the culture of architecture in Spain still, I think, remains at a very high level, and I think that the city-state vis-a-vis democracy has played a very strong role in Spain. The state, Madrid, in other words, also has played a role, but I think also the city-state has been incredibly important in the development of architecture in Spain. And also, I would say the schools of architecture in Spain have also been, have played a very important role in producing architects that have this caliber. You know? I mean, I think it used to be the case that on average, it took about 8 years for an architect to be produced by the Technical University of Madrid. And that whole thing has been shortened by the European Union, you know, by their Bologna Agreement. So that, in fact, I remember that I had once in my possession theses made by students in the 60s and 70s in Madrid that were so developed, not only aesthetically, but also technically, that in my opinion, they could have been built. You could have built these buildings, these projects by students from these drawings. That's never been true of any other architecture school I know of anywhere. And so it says a lot, I think, about the status of the architect in Spain and the status of architectural schools in Spain. I think that's still present, although it's not as strong as it was prior to the Bologna Agreement, which definitively made the normative time to qualify as an architect into a 5-year program. And that's one reflection. The other reflection is, of course, I totally agree with you, and I think the huge confusion that exists and is present all over the place. In Japan, in the work of Sana, for example, in the work of the late Zaha Hadid, in the work of Frank Gehry, I mean, and many others, where the big confusion is architecture as if it were fine art, architecture as if it's an art with a capital A. In other words, you know, to make it, so to speak, it's not good enough to be an architect, you have to be an artist, you know. That is a malaise of enormous dimensions, I think. And I've always been against that. And it remains an issue. It obviously does, you know, and I think it's probably coming to an end, but it has had an enormous following. The other thing I would like to touch on is the issue of democracy. I mean, I think it's what we are experiencing in the US right now, of course, is a total health crisis, of course, as elsewhere in the world, but also political chaos of enormous dimensions. And you know, and this is part of the context of the American situation, but it leads to, yes, this is my point basically, which has to do with this rather radical figure in the American scene, Bernie Sanders, for example, who is very preoccupied with two issues. One is free education, so-called free education, and the other is free health. I mean, education and health guaranteed by the state. I mean, this is a huge issue because in all, and he makes this point, of course, that in all other developed countries, he has in mind, of course, Europe in the main, but there are others, of course, Australia, for example, New Zealand. This is the case. I mean, health and education are guaranteed by the state. And of course, paid for by taxes. Which brings us to this question of democracy and of social democracy. I mean, I think it's fascinating that for Bernie Sanders, you know, it's a kind of joke in a way. The ideal state is Denmark, you know. And it is, I think, a fact that in a survey of the population of the Danes, who were asked the question, you know, many other countries in Europe, the question of, do you have enough? The most positive answers, which, yes, I think I do have enough, were coming out of Denmark as opposed to any other country. So here, this question of social democracy, which means, of course, regulated capitalism, not deregulated capitalism. And that's the huge issue, I think, that the British, the UK, and to some extent Europe, to a lesser degree, but certainly the British, and the United States, of course, has suffered from that, you know. And so I think, you know, if on the one hand, you know, it brings me to this question of also this question of periphery and center, and periphery and need, because you know, when you reflect on it, if you think of the Middle East, if you think of the whole Syrian civil war, if you think of the situation in Latin America in general, in Brazil. I mean, Brazil is a very interesting case because Brazil has had, and there still are architects of incredible stature in Brazil. I'm thinking in particular, of course, of Mendes da Rocha, who are basically architects on the left, you know, and you know,
but you know, Kenneth,
mm,
something that I would, you are mentioning the two, first of all, I will make a very short reference to Bernie Sanders. I agree with many of his proposals, but at the same time, when Bernie Sanders refused to call this person, we have this clown that we have directing this so-called revolution in Venezuela. When he rejects the idea of calling him a dictator, I think that Bernie Sanders missed the point completely.
Yeah.
He's trying some things inside the commonplaces of the left and some other things in a ground which we can discuss and debate. And that has happened with many other things. You know, you mentioned Brazil. Brazil is a very interesting country, apart from its size and everything. It is ruled now by a sort of clown.
No, totally. Yeah.
Like the United States, by the way.
Yeah,
But at the same time, when Brazilians refuse to treat very carefully the Amazonian forest, you know, when there is a sort of debate between people that try to conserve the Amazonian and the people that say the Amazonian has to be gained, has to be
exploited.
I don't know how to explain it.
Developed, I guess.
Colonized, let's say.
Yes,
you know, when you see that from Europe, you can see that in Europe the forests were destroyed throughout the history. You know, the big forests in Europe were destroyed by centuries of exploitation. And at the same time, now in Europe, you tell the people in Brazil that you shouldn't touch the Amazonian forest. I think that has to be considered in a different way. It has to be, I would say, moderated by the needs versus the pristine conservation of nature. That, I think, that is a point of debate. But there are other points, for instance, where you were talking about Brazil. There is an architect already dead, very well known in Brazil, not very well known in the world, his name was Lele.
Yes, yes.
Lele was a very good architect.
Yeah, yes.
And never received any attention from the outside world. In Brazil, everybody knew the value of Lele. But the Pritzker Prize jury gives a prize to a very weak architect like this Aravena, the Chilean young man.
Yes.
And never consider giving a prize to Lele, for instance. You have architects like Porçamparc, very weak architects.
Yes.
Very, and they have the Pritzker. And what is happening there? What is happening? Well, the central part of the world, the central countries have their say always when the issue is which are the best things to do, which is it's very difficult for him to express it, you know. But it is one thing, and I would like to point out, but maybe you have a comment on that, which is what is the trend now in terms of the young architects everywhere? It is considering the aesthetics of architecture the main important thing in the exercise of architecture. The aestheticism, you know, the refinement the extreme consideration of the elements that conform the building becomes the main issue, and all the other things are left behind. Like, for instance, the social dimension of architecture, which was in the modern project as a central thing, has been completely forgotten.
Yes.
Why?
Yes.
Well,
Yes.
okay.
No.
I'm sorry, Burke. I think we have more time.
No, les dijeron que quedaban 10 minutos.
Ah, okay. We have 10 minutes. Come on.
More. Yes, well, this is a very interesting conversation, and maybe it's being recorded, in which case it would be good to look back at it. But you raised a lot of issues. I mean, one, yes, well, let's go to the last issue, because I think that the School of Architecture, where I spent an enormous amount of my life, is in a state of total confusion today. And this issue of aesthetics, the one you raised, is absolutely right. You know, there's nothing kind of deep there at all. You know, it's just simply it's simply a kind of competitive individual game about. You know, at the level of aesthetics, it's not. It doesn't really take seriously it makes noises. Of course, it says it's taking seriously social, ecological, phenomenological issues, but and structural material issues, but it's not really the case. I mean, the confusion is enormous, and I don't know what's going to happen, because it's very, it seems to me to be overwhelming, really. And perhaps other schools in America are less decadent. I'm using that word. But, and they will kill me for it, of course, but I do think that, you know, I'm thinking of Harvard and Yale, of course, who I think are a little bit less confused, but generally the situation is very confused.
Okay.
And
we have a problem with the time.
yes,
I have this feeling of frustration, because we would need a lot of more time. I have to cut because they tell me that we have to cut. But let me tell you, this last thing about the aestheticism is very important, because apparently what it takes the attention of architects today is the extreme, I would say, refinement of the abstract condition of architecture as a sort of form of pictorial art. And that has been terrible, because you even have to dress in a certain way, like you, by the way, dark blue or black, or, you know, being a sort of special kind of object yourself, you know, and that has taken apart the conditions where architecture is produced. And that is the main thing for me in a country like this, destroyed, completely destroyed. If you want to read something interesting, today in New York Times, there is an article about Venezuela that you should read.
okay.
Now, I have to say goodbye, and I have to say some things in Spanish.
Okay, go ahead.
Kenneth, somos amigos, we are friends. And yo siempre estuve pendiente. I always wanted to talk to you about these things in public, because I think they are important. Son cosas que considero muy importantes. Y sobre todo, yo considero que el mundo de la crítica latinoamericana tiene que cortar un poco sus dependencias del mundo académico que se ha formado en torno a la crítica de arquitectura. I want to tell you that the architectural criticism has become a very important issue in the academic world. You know, it's like constructing a discipline with criticism named theory. There is not a possibility of a theory of architecture. It cannot exist a theory of architecture. What can be done is to have a thinking, to have philosophizing description, making literature about architecture. That is different. But there is not such a thing as theory. No hay tal cosa como teoría. Y eso hay que decirlo en los medios académicos, porque se han construido estructuras alrededor de eso. Bueno, yo lo que debería haber hecho, I should have done now is to say goodbye. Let me do it. Gracias, Kenneth, por esta conversación. Perdona mi énfasis. Forgive my emphasis. Forgive. The main thing is that I am a little nervous about whatever I want to say. Quiero decir muchas cosas. Es el problema. Y a Silvia le doy muchas gracias también. Silvia, come out, show yourself. Silvia she's also a good friend, I think.
Good.
Bueno,
Great.
Yo les agradezco muchísimo. I am grateful for having this opportunity, and I hope we will have another one sometime in the future, if we reach the future, which I don't know.
Yes. Okay, Oscar, thank you so much. It was great. Thank you.
Ciao.
Ciao.